One thing I've noticed over the years that is not particularly puzzling in light of examination of the issue is human beings' steadfast dedication to denying the fact that we are animals. In fact, many people, perhaps even most people, would straight up deny that that is a fact. They would say, well, that's not a fact. You're presenting this notion that we are animals as a fact. Now, there's the scientific biological aspect to this, and then there's the psychological, indeed even philosophical, and in some circles, religious aspect to this. And the interesting thing about this is that there are multiple sides here that will deny that we human beings are animals. You have the traditional, say, Christian conservative, maybe Muslim conservative, in general religious conservative, that will say, well, of course we're not animals, because God has forged us in his image, and therefore we cannot be animals. That's the traditional take. But the more liberal modern take is actually not that dissimilar. It goes back to a concept I've talked about before, so lip service to evolution. You want to pay lip service to evolution, but you don't actually believe in it. And so people on the left, progressives, liberals, will also steadfastly deny that we are animals, not because we were forged in the image of a god, but rather because they believe we have surpassed this nature, that at some point in time, amidst the primordial mist, we were, in fact, animals. But at some undisclosed juncture in that timeline, we not only moved past that, we surpassed it. We overcame our own natures as animals. Both sides take a completely different perspective on this in some sense, an approach to it, but they both fundamentally agree that we're not animals, that we're something different, we're something special. Now, to these types of people, I could spend all day until I'm blue in the face presenting evidence that, in fact, we are animals. We are, as I like to say, the fifth or sixth ape, depending on how you count them. But that doesn't really matter. Again, if you are so wedded to an idea, such as you're not an animal, because God told you so, or because you can look out your window and see skyscrapers and parks and infrastructure, because that is sort of the God, as it were, to the liberal progressive mind in this context, namely the establishment of civilization is the proof that we're not animals and that we can surpass our animal nature. There's not much I can say, other than perhaps that all these things exist on a continuum. Yes, we are quote-unquote special in the sense that at some point in time, we, through a combination of having the blessed morphology of hands with opposing thumbs and rather big brains, were able to emerge past a certain point that tends to limit other animals in their development. But that's not everything. I'm not going to waste too much time, although I certainly could, and I find it interesting, presenting the biological evidence as to why we're animals. It's pretty obvious to me, and I'm assuming that if you're familiar with my channel, and if you looked into this a bit yourself, then it's pretty obvious to you. And that's that. But I'm more interested in why people cling so steadfastly to this notion that we're not animals. I consider it a delusion, in fact. And the origin of that claim doesn't really matter so much, because there's always that quality that human beings are special. God created us, so we're special in his own image, not in the image of other animals, despite massive overlap in terms of our behavior, physiology, morphology, endocrine system, etc., etc. We're, despite all of that, made in the image of God, or the more liberal progressive, and I would argue these days the majority take, is that we're not animals anymore because we've surpassed this, because we have culture and rules, and we follow the law, and we pay the rent, and we go to our job, and what have you. To the liberal/progressive mind, this is evidence that, in fact, we are not animals, according to them. And this, of course, feeds into a whole other arc of discussion, as it were, namely this discussion of how much of our behavior is predicated on the biological versus the social. I recall not too long ago having a conversation with a 20-something female who studied some type of social science, who was willing to make the small concession that some of our behavior was biological, And by some, it was something like 30%. The rest is all about our social environment, which I thought was, frankly speaking, bizarre, but you know me by now, and you would know why I find that bizarre. But the one consistent thing here, whether left-wing, right-wing, or anything in between, is that people who say we're not animals think we're really special. And I'm going to talk about what this really ties into. Ultimately, this is about ego preservation and the denial of certain realities that, unfortunately, we're all affected by. You see, I believe that in order to live a healthy life, and I'm not claiming to be an exponent of this by any means, you need to trick yourself, deceive yourself. You need to delude yourself in a convincing way, such that your ego is not damaged, or at least it's not damaged enough that you can't function anymore. This is related to many things. So, for example, that whole discussion around AI artists, the one that Aspen Gold brought up, well, why do you think those people are in denial about their own, say, culpability in immorality and immoral acts when it comes to things that do not involve them? Because to acknowledge and concede their own fallibility in this case, their hypocrisy, we're all hypocrites at the end of the day, every one of us, is to diminish that ego that serves to preserve their mental health, their well-being, and indeed, in many respects, their motivation, their desires, and all these things that go along with that. In fact, as much as it could pain one to say this, you do yourself no favor in realizing that you're just like everybody else. If you're just like everybody else, you're not special. Now, I'm not saying that people aren't unique as individuals and they don't have unique components and aspects to their being. They certainly do. We are differentiated by our genes and environment at the level of individuals. But in the broad sense, we're all just pretty generic for the most part. Even the best among us. The best among us simply exemplify the generic to the highest degree. And so internally, I would argue, there's this constant battle, a tug of war, if you will, between what is and what you want to be as a human being, with respect to yourself, also with respect to the world, but specifically with respect to yourself. Oh, I'm a highly moral, righteous, upstanding citizen who produces his or her own art. I don't stoop to those nether-ridden depths of people who make use of AI art, for example. It's all a narrative. And this applies to everything. When you think about religious people, sincerely religious people, how they divide the world between those who've been chosen by God or not. Because in order to get through life, I think you really need to deny things to some degree that would otherwise hurt your ego. This ultimately goes back in part to an argument made by a guy named Ernest Becker, who wrote this famous book, The Denial of Death. His argument being that our inevitable, inexorable mortality makes it such that everything we do in the face of that is an effort to deny that fate, number one, and number two, before death finally takes you, to deny that that in fact is a reality and that it will take you. And so by his lights, and he might be partially incorrect about this, everything we do at its base has something to do with postponing the inevitability of that conflict between your psychology and your ultimate demise. And getting back to the original point there, if you think about it, if we're just animals, then, well, we just die like animals. We're no different fundamentally from the antelope that dies on the Serengeti, or the buffalo that's hunted down by a pack of hungry wolves, or any dead animal that you might see on the street. We're not that different, really. We're the same. And so every proclamation you hear that we're not animals, that we're special, is effectively, at the end of the day, an attempt to deny that reality. I don't claim to have the secret to live a good life. I'm not particularly good at it for the most part. But I don't think it's a requirement to live a good life to also believe that we are not animals, that we're special, that we are distinct from every other creature on earth in some fundamental way. Not that we're distinct, as I pointed out earlier, because I think it bears repeating. It's worth reiterating. Yes, we have these amazing hands and opposable thumbs, and we walk upright, and big brains. Yes, we are distinct in that respect, but distinct not in the sense of degree or on a continuum between us and other animals, but rather something completely different. People, you see, I think, hate limitations. That's another big one. People hate limitations. And so that student that I was talking to a while back, who insisted that the vast majority of our behavior is mediated by our social environment and our socialization upbringing, that's a perfect example of this. People dislike it when other people invoke genetics because, well, it implies a lack of control. Of course, this is its own can of worms. You know my thoughts on agency and free will. Separate discussion, sort of. But the reality is quite simply that if we create a fantasy in which most things are mediated by a social environment, it seems, with emphasis on the word seems, that we in fact nominally have more control over that environment, and then, as a consequence, more control over ourselves. We can then shape our behavior, if you buy into this, far more than we could if it's all just based on genes and biology. And so to wrap this up, I think I do ultimately, at least in part, buy into a large chunk of Ernest Becker's thesis of the denial of death, this idea that most of what we do in terms of ego preservation and ego inflation and denying certain things that I think are plainly true and facts has something to do with our attempts to postpone the inevitable. And the desire to control everything, be it through divine mandate, i.e. you're a religious person, or you're a modern progressive that believes every human behavior has almost nothing to do with biology, but rather is mediated by some kind of magical environment and culture, which all have their own mysterious origins. I think a lot of that boils down to the simple reality that people don't want to die. And in the process of postponing the inevitable and the thoughts that tend to overwhelm us and encompass us when we have to dwell on that specter of death, they come up with all kinds of things to preoccupy themselves with, including how special we are, including how different we are. We're not just animals. We're not just a special animal. We are human beings. Very, very special indeed. And because I'm so special, I'm also so morally righteous. I'm so much better than you. Obviously, that's not what I'm claiming. I'm no better than any of you. But you get my point. You get the artist who's preaching from the pulpit about AI art. You get vegans preaching from the pulpit about how evil humans are for eating meat. All this stuff gets funneled into this desire to preserve oneself, one's ego. As always, thank you for tuning in. Many special thanks to my patrons and donors on PayPal. You guys are the best. You keep the channel going. Without you, all would be dust and ash. Thank you so much. As for everybody else, if you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, it'd be much appreciated. Apparently that helps out the channel, although I've yet to see the results, unfortunately. If I'm still alive, I'll check you out next time. Until then, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.